Just got some breaking news in from Buckingham Palace, folks. So this statement has just come in from Buckingham Palace, and I'll read it for you. It goes on to say, His Majesty has today initiated a formal process to remove the style, titles...
A formal statement has just been issued by Buckingham Palace, and I'll read it for you. It states, His Majesty has today begun a formal process to remove the style, titles, and... 4 minutes later, everything changed. Inside a sealed royal council meeting, a decision was placed before the crown that no one in Camilla's circle believed could ever actually occur. Catherine was formally given the title of Queen Consort, stripping away the position Camilla had spent years fighting to secure. But the most disturbing moment came seconds later. As the wording of the decision was read aloud, Camilla's face drained of color, and she suddenly collapsed before the room could react. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe to 2 Minutes so you don't miss a single update. Camilla did not move when the first page was opened. She sat rigidly beside Charles, waiting for the interruption she expected, yet the king remained silent. That silence carried more weight than any speech. The Royal Council, the senior body advising the sovereign in this dramatized account on constitutional and ceremonial matters, had approved a royal settlement transferring the Queen Consort title from her to Catherine. The settlement was the written framework that gave the decision force inside the story, and its meaning was unmistakable. The role Camilla had spent years defending was being taken from her. Catherine lowered her eyes as the words continued. She did not smile, shift forward, or show any triumph. William watched her carefully and understood why. Her elevation was arriving through another woman's humiliation, and there was no clean way to separate the two. Across the table, Camilla kept looking toward Charles, searching his face for resistance. He gave her none. The monarch's hand stayed still, and with every second her confidence seemed to drain away. Then the clerk reached the decisive sentence. Camilla's fingers tightened around the edge of the table. She pushed back her chair, tried to rise, and suddenly lost her balance. Aides moved toward her as the room broke from silence into confusion. Charles stood several feet away, visibly stunned, while Catherine remained beside William, shaken by the human cost of what had just been announced. William's attention then fell on a notation near the bottom of the document. The transfer had been prepared before that morning's meeting. This was not a sudden vote born from an argument in the room. The outcome had already been shaped before Camilla arrived, believing she could stop it. As aides helped her toward the door, she turned once toward Charles. Her voice was weak, but the words landed with brutal clarity. You knew. Once that accusation reached the king, the question was no longer simply why Catherine had been elevated. It was how the people closest to Camilla had allowed her to walk into that room believing she was safe. The council may have changed the title, but what it truly shattered were 3 relationships built around the same crown. Camilla saw humiliation. Catherine felt the terrifying weight of an honor she had never expected to receive this way. And Charles faced the one consequence no royal document could soften, the knowledge that his wife believed he had abandoned her. Behind the titles were 3 people, each staring at the same decision and seeing an entirely different kind of loss. Camilla had spent years believing the Queen Consort title represented more than ceremonial rank. To her, it was proof that the long years of controversy, rejection, and public resistance had finally ended in acceptance. The position beside the sovereign carried symbolic weight because it told the country that she had not merely survived royal life. She had been formally accepted within it. Losing that place so suddenly therefore struck at something far deeper than protocol. Catherine felt the opposite pressure. She had always understood that greater responsibility would eventually come beside William, but she had imagined that transition arriving gradually, not through another woman's collapse. In a private side room, she turned toward the prince and spoke carefully. She did not want her elevation remembered as the moment Camilla was destroyed. William listened before answering that rejecting the decision now could create another crisis, suggesting division inside a family already under intense strain. Charles carried the hardest conversation alone. When he entered the quiet room where Camilla was recovering, she did not reach for him. She turned toward the window instead. He stepped closer and offered his hand, but she pulled hers away. "Why didn't you tell me?" The king hesitated. Then, in a private conversation later documented for the palace record within this dramatized account, he admitted that he had known a change of position was under discussion. He insisted, however, that he had not been shown the final wording that transferred the title immediately. Camilla looked back at him with wounded disbelief. Whether he knew every detail no longer seemed to matter. He had known enough to understand danger was coming, and he had still let her enter that chamber unprepared. William faced Catherine again later that evening with something even more troubling. He had reviewed the council dossier, the formal collection of briefing papers used to support the decision, and discovered that objections to Camilla's continued authority had been gathering for months. This had not begun that morning. It had been building quietly behind closed doors. Then one detail caught Catherine's attention. The same date appeared beside several objections. It belonged to a private Windsor ceremony almost no one outside the inner household knew had become contentious. To understand why that date frightened the palace so much, the story has to return to the moment when a quiet disagreement stopped being private and became the trigger for Camilla's downfall. Every royal crisis has a moment that looks insignificant until history circles back to it. For this one, that moment came inside Windsor Castle during a closed ceremonial rehearsal 3 months earlier. There were no cameras, no cheering crowds, and no public announcement. Just Camilla, Catherine, William, and a disputed instruction involving the future of the crown. What happened during those few private minutes would later become the single incident the council used to justify everything. Camilla entered that rehearsal expecting one thing to remain untouched, her place beside the crown. The private session had been arranged to settle ceremonial precedents for future state occasions and to decide who would carry certain responsibilities if royal duties shifted suddenly. In simple terms, ceremonial precedence determines who stands where, enters when, and represents the monarchy at key moments. Catherine's responsibilities were already growing beside William, but the Queen Consort believed that growth would happen beneath her existing authority, not through it. Then the instruction came. Camilla ordered Catherine removed from the principal consort position in the formation and moved further back. Her voice stayed controlled, but the meaning was unmistakable. There can only be one queen beside the crown. William reacted immediately. He challenged the instruction before the room could move on, arguing that the approved arrangement had already reflected Catherine's future responsibilities. The prince understood that this was not simply about where someone stood during a rehearsal. It touched the succession itself, because ceremonial roles often signal how authority is expected to pass from one generation to the next. Catherine quietly asked him not to escalate, but the humiliation was already there. She had been corrected in front of senior household staff and made to look as though her place had been deliberately reduced. The disagreement did not disappear when the rehearsal ended. The ceremony secretary produced a written account because Camilla's instruction had altered an approved succession protocol, meaning a formally agreed plan for how royal duties would pass during a transition. That record preserved every important detail, including William's objection and Catherine's attempt to calm the confrontation. Charles received the account that evening. According to the documented palace record used in this dramatized narrative, he privately reversed Camilla's instruction and restored Catherine to the original position. But the king chose not to confront his wife publicly. He believed silence would contain the damage. Instead, silence buried it. Camilla dismissed the written record as administrative paperwork and assumed the argument was over. Months later, that same document returned inside the council dossier. What she had treated as a minor disagreement had become evidence that her personal authority was colliding with the monarchy's planned transition. And once she understood that, her anger shifted toward Catherine. But paperwork alone could not remove a queen consort. The real break would come when Camilla confronted Catherine directly and demanded to know whether she had helped engineer the decision. There were no advisors between them now, no council clerks, no carefully prepared statements. Just Camilla and Catherine standing several feet apart in a private palace room, each carrying the weight of a title only one of them could possess. Camilla had spent hours believing Catherine had quietly waited for this moment. Catherine had spent those same hours dreading the accusation. Then the door closed. Camilla turned toward her, and the confrontation the palace feared finally began. Camilla had requested the meeting herself, after recovering from the collapse, and she had made one condition clear: no staff, no aides, no messages carried through other people. She wanted the truth directly. Catherine agreed because she understood what was at stake beyond the title. If bitterness continued through private whispers and competing households, the damage could follow William into his future reign and turn a painful transition into a lasting family fracture. Camilla did not waste time. "Did you know they were giving you my title?" Catherine held her gaze. She admitted that she knew changes were being discussed, but she had not known the council would transfer the position that morning. Her answer did little to calm the queen consort. Camilla accused her of standing quietly while years of criticism gathered around her, then benefiting at the exact moment that pressure finally broke through. Catherine's restraint hardened. She told Camilla that she had never asked to be elevated through another woman's humiliation. The words landed sharply because there was no celebration behind them. Catherine had seen the collapse. She had watched Charles freeze. She had understood in that instant that whatever authority came with the title would always be linked to the way it had been taken from someone else. Then Catherine revealed something Camilla had not expected. In a private conversation with William before the council session, she had urged him to support a delay. She feared an immediate transfer would look less like an orderly constitutional change and more like punishment. The prince had listened, but neither of them controlled the final decision. Camilla's anger shifted. If Catherine had tried to slow the transfer, then she was not the strongest force behind it. The queen consort stepped closer and asked the question that suddenly mattered more than every accusation before it. "Then who wanted this?" Catherine paused. "Ask the people who signed it." The answer changed the room. Camilla later examined the authorization page and recognized several names she had expected to see. Then her eyes stopped. Charles. His signature sat beneath the settlement. That signature transformed her anger into something colder. Because if the king had authorized the settlement, then the real battle had never been between two women. It had been fought inside the machinery of the crown. Camilla could fight Catherine, she could challenge William, she could dismiss courtiers, question advisors, and condemn the council that had embarrassed her. But one signature changed the entire balance of power. Charles had approved the instrument, not enthusiastically, not without hesitation, but unmistakably. And when Camilla finally saw his name beneath the transfer, she understood that the decision had crossed the one boundary she believed could never be crossed. Her husband had chosen the crown over her. Charles knew exactly what that signature meant. The royal settlement could not take effect without the sovereign's authorization, meaning the final responsibility rested with him, whether he welcomed it or not. He had resisted an immediate transfer for weeks because he feared confusion around the monarchy's structure and the damage it would cause inside his marriage. But resistance had limits. Once the council placed the full case before him, delay began to look less like caution and more like personal protection. The king sat alone with the file after the meeting and read the signed page again. He removed his glasses, placed them beside the document, and said nothing. A senior aide waited several feet away, unwilling to break the silence. Charles finally admitted that protecting Camilla indefinitely would create a deeper problem if he appeared willing to preserve her position despite growing constitutional objections. His loyalty as a husband could be seen as stronger than his duty as monarch. The council's argument had gone far beyond the Windsor confrontation. Catherine had already been carrying more public responsibility, absorbing greater ceremonial pressure, and standing beside William as his future role expanded. Members believed the monarchy was functioning as though the next phase had already begun while its formal structure remained trapped behind it. The Windsor incident simply exposed that contradiction in a way no one could ignore. William had made one decision of his own. He refused to personally demand Camilla's removal. The prince understood that any such request could make the transfer look like a son forcing his father's wife aside for his own advantage. Instead, he left the final judgment where it belonged, with Charles. That choice removed the easiest excuse the king could have used. Camilla understood the cruelty of that truth almost immediately. Catherine had not forced the outcome. William had not issued an ultimatum. The council had built the case, but Charles had given it life, and once his signature settled the title, everything else began to move. By the following morning, the decision stopped being words on a page and began changing doors, schedules, staff assignments, and the daily reality of Camilla's royal life. The cruelest part did not arrive in the council chamber. It came the next morning through small changes that were impossible to ignore. A briefing folder no longer arrived. A ceremonial meeting disappeared from Camilla's schedule. Staff who once waited for her direction were suddenly answering to another office. Nothing dramatic was shouted. No one slammed a door, yet with every quiet adjustment the same message became harder to escape. The title was gone, and the palace had already begun moving without her. Camilla noticed the missing folder before anyone explained it. The morning council briefing had always been part of her routine, carrying updates tied to ceremonial duties, patronages, and upcoming responsibilities. Now it was absent. Those details mattered because royal influence was not only found in titles, it lived in access, schedules, staff, precedents, and the quiet ability to shape what happened next. When she asked an aide where the folder was, the answer came softly. The queen consort said nothing at first. She looked toward the untouched breakfast tray and seemed to understand that the transfer was already becoming real in dozens of small ways. Meetings were reassigned, staff instructions changed, patronage briefings began moving elsewhere. What had once belonged automatically to her position was now being reorganized around someone else. Charles entered later and found her still sitting there. He tried to speak gently, but Camilla cut through the hesitation. She told the king the palace had managed to erase years of work before she had even understood what had happened. He answered that her charitable work would not disappear, but she shook her head. That was not the point. The structure around her had changed overnight, and no reassurance could make that feel temporary. Then, an unexpected message arrived. Catherine had refused to move into Camilla's former private office. She instructed staff to leave every personal item exactly where it was until the Queen Consort decided what should happen. The decision reached Camilla through a household aide, and for the first time since the council meeting, her anger became less certain. Catherine was not behaving like someone celebrating victory. That realization disturbed her almost as much as the transfer itself. It meant the conflict could no longer be reduced to a simple enemy standing on the other side. By evening, Camilla made a decision of her own. She wrote a short handwritten note asking Catherine to meet again. No advisors, no officials, no Charles. And when the two women met again with no council standing behind either of them, the crisis finally shifted from a battle over rank into something far more human. This time, Camilla did not enter looking for someone to blame. Catherine did not enter prepared to defend herself. The anger that had filled their first confrontation had burned down into something quieter and more dangerous because neither woman could hide behind it. There were no aides in the room and no royal documents between them. For the first time since the council's decision, the former holder of the title and the woman inheriting it spoke not as symbols, but as two people. Camilla had requested the meeting because anger had stopped giving her answers. Attacking Catherine would not reverse the settlement, and it would not repair what had broken between her and Charles. Catherine respected that by arriving alone. No staff waited nearby to carry messages. No prepared statements sat between them. What happened next would remain a private conversation, rather than another piece of palace machinery. Camilla spoke first. She admitted that losing the title had wounded her, but that was not the deepest cut. What had truly broken something inside her was entering the council chamber, believing Charles would protect her, then realizing the decision had already moved beyond their marriage. The king had once represented the final place where personal loyalty could still shield her. That belief was gone. Catherine listened without interrupting. Then she offered a truth of her own. Receiving the position had not felt like triumph. It had felt like inheriting responsibility through someone else's pain. She knew every future appearance would be measured against the moment Camilla collapsed, and every success could be interpreted as proof that one woman had risen because another had fallen. Camilla finally asked the question she had been carrying since morning. Would Catherine take everything, the charities, causes, and personal work still attached to the years she had spent serving beside Charles? Catherine answered immediately, no. She made the distinction clear. Institutional succession meant the formal transfer of royal responsibility from one person to another. It did not require personal erasure. Camilla could continue the causes that had become part of her identity, and Catherine had no intention of turning transition into punishment. The answer changed something. Before leaving, Camilla reached for a handwritten set of private notes she had prepared over years in the role. They contained warnings, pressures, and small lessons no official briefing could explain. She handed them to Catherine without ceremony. It was not surrender, but it was acknowledgement. The transfer would stand, and with that private understanding finally reached, the palace had room to move forward. The family had found a fragile peace behind closed doors, but outside the palace gates, Britain was only just discovering what had happened. By sunrise, the private crisis belonged to the world. Phones lit up. Broadcasters abandoned scheduled programming. Newspaper editors tore apart finished front pages. What had begun as a closed council decision was now being interpreted as a judgment on two royal women and the future direction of the monarchy. Yet among thousands of headlines, one image captured the moment more powerfully than any commentary. Catherine entering the palace while Camilla's car quietly departed through another gate. Buckingham Palace released the formal announcement soon after, confirming that Catherine had assumed the Queen Consort title as part of a wider royal transition. The phrase sounded controlled, but its meaning was enormous. This was no temporary adjustment. The title had moved, the ceremonial balance had changed, and the monarchy was publicly acknowledging a transfer that had already transformed life behind palace doors. William watched the first television reports beside Catherine without saying much. The prince heard commentator after commentator describe her elevation as a victory, but he knew how deeply she rejected that language. Catherine had not entered the new role celebrating Camilla's loss. She had entered it carrying the knowledge that every headline about her rise would also reopen the story of another woman's collapse. Camilla watched the same coverage privately. She remained composed until one presenter described her years beside Charles as an era abruptly closed. The words struck harder than expected. She had already accepted that the title would not return, but hearing her time in the role reduced to a finished chapter made the loss feel public in a way the council chamber never had. What had once belonged to private grief was now being discussed by millions. Then one front page came to define the day. Outside Victoria Station, a special evening edition appeared with two enormous words across the top, "A New Queen." Beneath them sat side-by-side photographs of Catherine entering Buckingham Palace and Camilla leaving earlier that day. The contrast was brutal. One woman appeared to be moving toward the center of royal life, while the other seemed to be moving away from it. Outside the palace, the mood was just as divided. Crowds gathered behind the barriers, some holding photographs of Catherine, others openly expressing sympathy for Camilla. There was excitement, but also discomfort. Britain was not watching a simple celebration. It was watching succession, loss, ambition, duty, and family pain collide in public. Inside, the palace prepared one final appearance. The title had been transferred. The country had delivered its reaction, and only one thing remained. The family had to show what the decision actually meant when they stood together afterward. In the end, there was no reversal, no last-minute intervention, no hidden clause returning the title to the woman who had lost it. Catherine remained queen consort, Camilla accepted that her chapter in that role had closed, and Charles was left carrying the cost of choosing monarchy over marriage when the two could no longer be protected equally. But the final meaning of the crisis was not found inside the council document. It appeared in what each person chose to do afterward. Camilla understood first that the transfer was final. The palace confirmed Catherine's position permanently, while the former queen consort retained carefully defined charitable and family responsibilities without the title she had once believed completed her royal journey. That distinction mattered because it allowed her work to continue, even as her constitutional position ended. Charles made no attempt to reverse the settlement, confirming that his signature had been a final decision rather than an act of temporary pressure. The king met Camilla privately before the family's first appearance following the announcement. He apologized for allowing duty to turn into secrecy and admitted that he should have told her how serious the council's discussions had become. She listened quietly before answering with the truth that had haunted the entire crisis. Losing the title had hurt, but discovering that he had been afraid to tell her what was coming had hurt more. Charles could not defend himself against that. He simply accepted it. Catherine approached Camilla shortly afterward, with none of the triumph outsiders had attached to her rise. The two women stood together without advisors between them. Camilla noticed a small fold in Catherine's sleeve and straightened it almost instinctively. "Carry it better than I did." Catherine thanked her softly. There was no dramatic embrace and no sudden rewriting of everything that had happened. The gesture meant something stronger. Both women had accepted the reality of the transfer without pretending the pain had disappeared. William understood the wider meaning as he watched them prepare to step forward together. The prince realized that this had never truly been about replacing one woman with another. The monarchy had accelerated its next generation before circumstances forced a harsher transition. Catherine had gained authority, but with it came pressure. Camilla had lost rank, but not every part of the life she had built. And Charles had preserved the crown at a personal cost he could never completely undo. The council handed Catherine the title, but no one walked away victorious. One woman surrendered the position she had fought years to reach. Another accepted a crown-shaped burden she could no longer postpone. And a king discovered that protecting the monarchy sometimes means living permanently with the wounds created by the choice. The transfer was complete, the old chapter was closed, and the crown had chosen its future. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like this video and subscribe to 2 Misses so you never miss the next update. We'll see you in the next one.